welcome to episode 27 of the Simply Great Relationships podcast. We're so glad you could join us today. I'm Marina Veron, and with me is Meredith Silversmith, and today we're talking about how to stop fighting about money, a topic that I think is near and dear to a lot of couples' hearts. We'll be covering some good stuff. What makes it hard to talk about money? Why couples fight about money, one of the most common fights. How to get on the same page when it comes to finances. So make sure that you stay until the very end because we've got a really great bonus for you and we'll tell you how to get it when we get there.
Yep, you bet. I think this is a really good topic because I would say it comes up with probably every couple that I work with. And in our lives as well. You know, finances are a touchy subject, so I'm glad we're finally covering it. So Marina, what makes it so hard to talk about money, do you think, for couples?
I think money is a tricky thing because we think of money as something that is so tangible, but it's actually something that's very, very emotionally charged because it's so emotionally linked. We're not tied to the pieces of paper. We're tied to the meaning that we attribute to them, but we don't take the time to sit down and really process and then converse with our partner about what is that meaning. We just expect we have a meaning, our partner has that meaning, and that creates room for a lot of headbutting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can mean, you know, like you said, it can sort of mean different things to different people. And it's not always something that gets talked about. It's not like you sit down before you get married and say, so what does money mean to you? You know, what are your lifelong goals financially? That's some of the things that come to mind when you think about what money can sort of symbolize for people. It can symbolize freedom, right? Freedom to do what you want to do and to be free from burden in some way or free from stress in some way. It can be a form of accomplishment, right? I've reached a certain level or a certain goal, and that makes me feel like I've attained what I've wanted to attain, you know?
I think going with the accomplishment, this is like same but a little bit different, is really attributing success to financial success and failure to financial quote unquote failure because people get stuck on like magic numbers, you know, and when we internalize and put contingencies on the success, like I'll only feel successful when I hit X number. Yeah. And before that, I'm a failure. That's a really self-deprecating narrative. Very powerful one. I also think money, power, right? Like I think that's a very socially propagated narrative that's very true for a lot of people. They associate having money with feeling a certain sense of autonomy, so a certain sense of personal power and a certain sense of social power. And they see going without as a weakness because that's the opposite of power. So a lot of emotionally charged stuff there.
Definitely. And I'm thinking about, I know you and I have spoken about this, and I've had a disproportionate number of clients reference this show and that they've really connected on some level with this show. And I think you know what I'm going to say. Billions on Showtime, right? So
great show.
It's a very interesting show, and we like it for the psychology and the storyline. But there's a lot of power play in that show. And a big way that is, you know, portrayed is through money, you know, and you've got, oh man, I can't remember his name. My favorite guy.
Axe.
Yeah. Axe has tons of money. And then you've got, you know, the person on the quote unquote right side of the law who's sort of trudging ahead and, you know, struggling financially as an individual. And the way that that power sort of interplays between them does come up, it like bubbles up around money. And I've had many clients actually reference that show because it seems to portray something that sort of hits people in a really like, they can really relate in some way.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think that's just a great representation of what we're talking about, how it can really play in to the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think a really good takeaway from that show is regardless of how much money you have, money
Mm-hmm.
is a stressor.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, and fear of losing and fear of not getting enough and fear of not keeping up momentum is always a stressor because I think another really common projection onto money is when I have this number in the bank, like a switch will turn on and I'll feel at ease and
Mm-hmm.
everything will be great. And I think that show is actually a wonderful representation of the fact that that's not really true. And I know, like, you and I both have clients in this demographic where, the money they have doesn't necessarily make them feel more at ease, it makes them feel more stressed.
Yeah, absolutely. We see stress around not having enough. And then when you do, quote unquote, have enough, there's a lot of stress around losing it.
Mm-hmm.
So there isn't necessarily a point at which people feel peaceful and calm around money unless they're really, I think, actively working on that emotionally.
Yeah, and I think that is a possible place to get to, but again, it's working on it emotionally. I
Mm-hmm.
also think money, it's really tied to expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And expectations are really tied to our hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
And we have kind of our money reality versus our money fantasy almost, or like our
Yeah.
money goals and our money dreams and what it would mean if we had
Mm-hmm.
XYZ and how we would feel.
Yeah.
That's the expectation is how we would feel once we hit that magic number. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people hit their magic number and say, I don't feel that different.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And this expectation, how I see it, at least in my work, is it gets, it's not only a self expectation, it's an expectation of your partner. When my partner
Mm-hmm.
makes this much, or
Yeah.
when we make this much,
Mm-hmm.
life will feel like this. So until then, let us hold our breath
Mm-hmm.
because the magic switch is going to go off and everything's going to be fairy tales and roses.
Yeah. It's kind of like, don't worry about resolving the issues we're experiencing now because as soon as we reach that point, they're going to go away. And odds are they're not going to go away when you hit the switch.
Yeah, and odds are that when you hit that target, you're gonna encounter a whole other slew of responsibilities that comes with that target.
Mm-hmm.
Because money is also very tied to responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think when you get into that zone of partner A and partner B and what they each expect of themselves and each other around money, you're likely to find that there are differences there. And there are different
Correct.
perspectives, there's different levels that they're looking for. They may feel differently on how we're supposed to get this money, how we're supposed to spend it, save it, use it, not use it. There's so many little pieces around finances that odds are you're going to disagree with your partner. And there's this feeling that I'm right and you're wrong,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what. And it's sort of interesting because we talk about that a lot around a lot of different issues, but I do feel like with money people tend to get very, very rigid and ingrained in feeling that their way is the right way.
Yeah, I mean, everybody becomes like the world's best financial planner when it comes to money because, again, it's so emotionally tied. And there's also a lot of fear around, like, if I have this plan that I've set out for myself
Mm-hmm.
and I expect my partner to be on the same page and they're not, like, what kind of vulnerabilities does that bring up for me in terms of my own work and in terms of our relationship? What does this say about our relationship?
Yeah, very true. So, one piece that you can start to work on if this feels familiar to you is go back to episode 5, How to Win a Fight, and download the bonus, the Win-Win End to an Argument Guide, because that's going to walk you through how to get unstuck and how to stop focusing on where you differ and start focusing on where you are aligned. So if this is at all touching on your reality, pop back there real quick and listen and download that. Let's talk a little bit more about why couples fight about money, because we know why money's so emotionally charged now, but what does it do between partners, do you think?
Well, I think the biggest thing is couples fight about money because, again, they look at it as like tangible pieces of paper or credit cards or whatever, without asking, what does it mean for me and what does it mean in the context of our relationship?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're working, like, people love their jobs. I love my job.
Mm-hmm.
I know you love your job, but at the end of the day, like, we're working because we also love our incomes and the things they afford us.
Mm-hmm.
And when we are not able to get on the same page in terms of like, what does it mean that I trade my time for money? What does it mean that I'm putting my effort and I'm investing in this way in order to get money? And what does that, and I bring that into our relationship, and what does that mean? And what does that look like? And how do we allocate it? And what are the things that we value?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the things that are important for me as an individual? What are my non-negotiables
Mm-hmm.
around my values? There's just a ton of expectations and projections there that create, your perfect battlefield.
Yeah. And it's, I agree. And what you're describing is each partner coming from their own individual place. And when you're coming from your own individual place and bringing those beliefs and those values to the table, and you don't necessarily agree completely, it's really easy to get polarized and to focus on where we don't agree and get more ingrained and entrenched in your position and
Mm-hmm.
just be on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. So you have one partner who is like, we have to save all of our money. And then you have another partner who's like, no, we have to spend all of our money. And it's a little grayer than that, but this is what tends to happen, right? We start with, I think we should save X amount per month. Well, what about taking a trip or going out to a really nice dinner once a month? And it sort of pushes each other, and you can see it when couples talk about it and they get more and more rigid
Mm-hmm.
and ingrained, and then all of a sudden you've got these sort of extreme perspectives being communicated.
Yeah, I feel like it almost brings out that oppositional
Mm-hmm.
adolescent that feels so vulnerable to like their parents' power and rule
Mm-hmm.
and wants to rebel against it so bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're no longer communicating with our partner.
Mm-hmm.
That hierarchy, that equal seeing eye to eye,
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden feels very skewed. It's like, well, why does my partner think they're up here and they can tell me what I can do with my money?
Mm-hmm.
Or the other way, like, why is my partner not listening to me? I know everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes a relationship that should be between two equals a hierarchical one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the foundation for destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it starts to feel like an enemy. And you feel
Mm-hmm.
like your partner is against you. And again, you're coming at it like this head to head rather than coming at it together against the money, right? If there's an issue with money,
Mm-hmm.
let's pair up and team up against that issue rather than fight each other on it. Um, Something that can also come up, I mean, there's so many nuances as I'm just thinking through what has come up in the past. If both partners are working, if one partner's working and one partner's not, uh, the connection and the value to the finances and the areas of sensitivity can really differ,
Mm-hmm.
but they play out in so many different ways. But even looking at long term versus short term goals, What are our long-term goals? What are our short-term goals? Which are things we've talked about in previous episodes that a lot of couples don't necessarily even look at,
Mm-hmm.
which could be really helpful to pop back to last week's episode, 26, how to have the best New Year's Eve, because we talk about creating your individual goals
Mm-hmm.
for the year, creating your couple's goals, and, finances are not exempt from that.
I think finances should definitely be at the top of the list for that,
Mm-hmm.
actually, because finances are always going to come up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So being proactive in tackling them really has a huge advantage in your relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I also think a big thing here is our views and attitudes about money usually don't come from the most rational place. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like we all read, financial books and go like, yes, this makes a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm.
They usually come from our family of origin. They come from um, what we saw growing up,
Mm-hmm.
what we went with, what we went without.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that really impacts us. And again, if we don't talk about it and we just expect our partner to know, uh, it causes a lot of room for um, arguments to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we talked about this in a previous episode. We'll have to put in the show notes which one. But, if one partner internalized, mom loves me because she buys me presents.
Mm-hmm.
So the way mom shows love is by spending money on me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, wow, what an emotional connection.
Yeah.
That could be so different from your partner who uh, dad worked 3 jobs
Mm-hmm.
and we never saw dad and we lived without and we had to make these sacrifices
Mm-hmm.
for money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like it can play out different ways even in those scenarios, right? Because you're going to have someone who internalized the way their parents did it and says consciously or unconsciously, I want to do it the exact same way because that way was right. And then you have someone who wants to do the exact opposite of what their parents did
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't like the way it felt or they saw conflict around money. So it can play out either way. And it's likely that you're going to step on each other's toes and that you're going to hit those buttons of sensitivity because you weren't raised in the same family, you weren't raised in the same house. And we certainly wouldn't expect you to come into a relationship having the exact same perspective on money. So it's really important that you take the time to understand where each of you learned about money, what you learned about money, what emotional ties you have about money, to really get a deeper understanding of what's there for you
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, mentally, hopes and dreams wise, values wise. So, a really good way to talk through that is using the communication tip sheet from episode 1. Because without that, it's really hard to move forward from there.
Yeah, I would just add to that list of things to explore about money is fears.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a lot of people, like money is security, lack of it is fear.
Yeah.
Uncertainty and fear. So it's really like what a vulnerable part of yourself to share, like using the communication tip sheet. It's all about sharing those really vulnerable parts of yourself. That's why we made it for you, because that's not easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our Halloween episode is also a really good one to listen to before having this conversation. If you know it's going to be a really emotionally charged one for you,
Yeah.
to talk about what are the fears around it and what are the fears that came from your family around money. What were the narratives that you heard growing up? Like, what makes money a bit of a tense thing for everybody? We all have a different story behind that.
Yeah. And I've heard some really interesting narratives lately with some of my clients. I've heard, I think, like the most polarizing well, maybe not the most polarizing, but like a very polarizing two views has been we need to live our lives now and we need to enjoy ourselves now because we could end up, late in life without the health or ability to enjoy ourselves. And I don't want to regret not having done things now. I want to live in the present, being paired with someone who feels fear around retirement and being prepared for the golden years and having a really peaceful and well established retirement life and being able to do things, so like those are really polarized.
Those are really polarized. However, it doesn't mean you can't have a little bit of both if you are very vulnerable and then you're very strategic. If you really build that understanding first and then problem solve and build the strategy on top of it.
Absolutely, because without that, you're fighting this fight and you don't know where the other person's coming from. You just think that they're disagreeing with you.
Yeah, like you'll never see my side. And then all that doubt creeps in of, what does that say about our relationship? Well, what it says about your relationship is you haven't had a really critical conversation you needed to have.
Yep. Absolutely. So let's talk about how to get on the same page for finances. Woohoo! Yes. Same page. So obviously first you have to go through the process of getting that depth of understanding of where each person's coming from. And only then can you move forward. And what would they move forward to?
So my big thing, and I really, again, I'm not a financial advisor. I'm a couples therapist. But I really encourage couples to agree to financial transparency. Once that understanding piece is really like checked off.
Yeah.
Like you really get where each of you is coming from, what's important to you, what are the fears, what are the apprehensions, what are the bigger picture goals. I think that there needs to be transparency. Because to me, transparency is the ultimate step in compromise and strategic problem solving.
Yeah, I totally agree. And transparency around any area of your relationship builds trust. And it's easier to feel like you're on the same team rather than opposing sides if you have trust around finances. So if I know my partner's history with money and I know why they think the way they think and I know what they think and believe around money, and we have transparency where I know what they're doing and they know what I'm doing, then any disagreements you come to, you've got all the information you need to come to resolution and understanding. So you're starting from a place of being able to be successful in resolving disagreement rather than being sort of like all the way down the mountain and having to go through so many other paths before you can even get to think about how we're going to resolve this.
Yeah, and I think just from a sheerly strategic point of view, when you have financial transparency, like there isn't kind of this mystery carrot being dangled in front of anybody, but also like you have a clear picture of everything that's going in and out.
Yeah.
And I think that's very grounding. Like I really like Mint. You know, my husband and I have separate accounts and joint accounts, but all our accounts are on Mint, so we can see where everything is. And just from an organization and transparency point of view, just makes it very like mentally palatable to see everything and to be transparent. And I think it like really reduces feelings of criticism and contempt when you're like, well, where did that money go? You don't need to ask your partner because that can feel like a really attacking question. Like, you can just go on your app and see.
Yeah. That's a great suggestion. Um, I would say the next step after creating transparency around money is to work towards creating a shared vision for your finances. So consciously compromise and integrate your beliefs into a shared plan for your financial health. A great way to do this is go back to episode 6, how to get your partner to say yes, and download the compromise cheat sheet, because that's going to help you walk through step by step how to integrate your different perspectives. But basically, you're going to look for areas of agreement, right? We start with where we agree. Find your shared goals, your shared dreams, start there, expand on that, and that's how we sort of begin the compromise process.
Yeah, I think couples lose sight of that because it's so easy to focus on what you have not in common, but really pushing yourself to find the places you do agree is great, and a really, really big way to move forward. So the next step would be to review the areas of disagreement. And after you go through where you agree, I think like very rarely do couples like really have like minimal things they work on. Like we all want a house and we all want a vacation and we all want to be able to go out for dinner, but we all want to feel secure in retirement. Like bigger picture, I think people are not that different, you know, but our areas of disagreement, we tend to blow them up. Is there flexibility or are they non-negotiables? And this is where you really have to go back to, I want to say it's also episode 6, but we'll put it in the show notes. Are your non-negotiables really non-negotiables? Or are you in oppositional teenager mode because the hierarchy in your relationship's a little skewed right now and you're just digging your heels in for the sake of digging your heels in? In the areas where you disagree, where can each of you be a little bit more flexible?
Yeah. Yep. Compromise with me like I'm someone you love.
Exactly.
John Gottman. I think. Definitely not a Meredith Silversmith original. If there is flexibility, right? So if you find those areas of disagreement and you can create some wiggle room, create some flexibility, move through the compromise process from episode 6. Find little pieces of commonality between even your disagreements. How can we achieve both of our goals at the same time, right? How can we save for a house and spend for dinners out at the same time? Compromise. Agree on, we're going to devote this to this and this to that, and we're going to work towards both of our goals because they're both valuable and important.
And this is where I think that focus on quality of life, like really, really comes in strong. To go in with the attitude of, this problem may not have the most clear-cut solution. The solution is improving the quality of life we have around this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, if you're finding that you have a non-negotiable, and really there shouldn't be more than 2 or 3, like very, very minimally are beliefs around finances that each of you have really, truly non-negotiable. But if you find you're hitting that wall, the question moves away from how are we going to compromise and agree on this to how can we live with this perpetual problem. This is going to be one of those 69%ers that never gets resolved that you have to learn how to cope with. So how can we live with this? Do we need to have separate finances in some areas? So maybe it's, if I have a spending goal and I have a savings goal, maybe we're going to have separate accounts for those particular goals, right? Maybe I have my side account that I put money away for the things that my spouse doesn't necessarily agree with, and he or she does the same. Sort of handling it that way and still having transparency, but setting a boundary around your comfort, what you're comfortable with and what you're not.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a ton of sense, and I think this is where a lot of people don't do that introspection is, where are my boundaries really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's where like that individual self-reflective process comes in.
Mm-hmm.
First is figuring out your own stuff before all of these conversations. Where do these boundaries come from for me?
Yeah. And I think, just to touch on fully separate versus fully combined finances. I know this is something that comes up with couples at times, and I actually don't know that you and I have talked about this in detail. So I'm curious if we see eye to eye, but I don't think there's anything inherently good or bad with either. I think it's really about communication and transparency and respect for each other. So if you do choose to keep your finances separate for a particular reason, I think the risky area is this feeling of what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, and we don't have so much of a we. So I do think that's probably an area that I would always focus on with couples with separate finances, is how do you create a feeling of we, even if you're maintaining separate bank accounts or separate money. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
My thoughts are very much so in line with yours, actually, which I'm not surprised about. But yeah, I think this is an important distinction to draw. You can have transparency without having combined finances. Very easy to do. I think transparency is the first step, but I do think there is something to, I don't think you need to combine all your finances like they're a pool, but to having some combined finances that make you feel like you're building something together financially and you're working towards a bigger picture together, as opposed to when the finances are completely separate. Like, what does that communicate in your relationship?
Yeah.
Versus how might each partner internalize that? I know that for some people that's a big wall. And that's a big, like, maybe do they not trust me? Do they not see this as long term? Do they not see me as financially compatible, as compatible? You know, like, there's a lot of ways this can be read into.
Yep.
And I just think that for most non-complex situations, because I know financial situations get extremely complex, having the completely separate always brings up a bit of a flag for me. It's definitely something I explore with couples that I have, because there can be a lot of feelings internalized and a real mismatch between the message a partner internalizes and the other partner tends to send.
Yeah. Definitely. And, it comes back to communication, right? So at the end of the day, it's all about having your message be clear, be accurately understood, be free of the four horsemen, you can pretty much make anything work as long as there's open and honest and transparent communication and understanding. So that's our 2 cents on separate versus combined finances. Gosh, I feel like this was a doozy of an episode, guys. For two people who are not financial planners, I feel like we just put a lot of financial advice on the table. So listen, as always, we don't want you to just listen. We want you to listen and integrate this into your relationship. So we have put together a bonus, the Happy Couples Guide to Shared Finances, for you, and you can get it on our website at simplygreatrelationships.com/027.
Let's talk about takeaways.
Let's.
What's your big takeaway?
Oh gosh. I think the idea of financial transparency, which, I see it as, how do I put this? So there's intentionally not being transparent, right? There's hiding things from your partner.
Mm-hmm.
There's like doing online shopping and hiding the boxes or stuff like that. And then there's just not taking the time to be transparent. And I think those are two different intentions, but the outcome is the same.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is something that I'm taking away, that even if it's not intentional, it's still damaging. And you really need to set aside the time and the energy to have conversations around your finances and build that open communication on a consistent basis.
Mm-hmm.
What about for you?
I think that idea that a lot of people forget about, that we have our beliefs and thoughts and ideas and goals around money that probably predate our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we're working in a certain way, it's not necessarily because we want to work against our partner.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't have that conversation, it can certainly feel that way.
Yeah.
Definitely. So my big takeaway is to have that conversation. And you know what? Sometimes it's not a one-time conversation. Sometimes it's a conversation with a whole lot of follow-up refresher conversations.
Very true.
So my big takeaway is that we're all kind of a product of our histories, and our relationship with money is very much so tied to that.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to build self-awareness and couple awareness around that.
Yeah.
Before we can do any problem solving, any strategic goal setting.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important.
That's a great point.
So that's all for today. This was, I think, a big episode, but hopefully a very useful one that resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah.
We hope that you take these tips and start using them right away.
Mm-hmm.
We'd love to continue the conversation with you in our Facebook group, where we'll be hooking you up with tips, with tricks, with live streams exclusively for our members. You can find our group at Facebook/groups/simplygreatrelationships, or you can just go on our website and click the link at simplygreatrelationships.com.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see you next week, guys.
Yep.
Bye.